Check.
Hey, Irv, could you speak into the mic so I can see if the Facebook Live's picking up the sound?
Yes. Is that good? Can you hear?
Asking Marilia right now. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. can just not sit there.
No, I'm
Maybe.
sitting over
Awesome.
there.
Great.
Yeah.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the forum this evening. It's a great pleasure to be. Is that better?
Great.
I usually project pretty well, but it doesn't ever hurt to have a microphone. So, it's a great pleasure to host this event. We're at the school. I would say the recruitment of Qin Gao was one of our great accomplishments in the last several years. And I'm quite familiar with her research. She's done the seminal research on the income distribution effects of the welfare state in China. And her book is path-breaking. I won't say much more about it, except that I've learned a great deal from reading it, and I look forward to this discussion, too. Oh, I'm sorry, I was given this sheet to remind me to greet those of you who are on Facebook Live. And we will try to involve you if we don't forget.
Thank you so much, Irv, and thank you all for coming in this beautiful evening. You're supposed to be outside enjoying the beautiful weather or spend time with your family, but instead you're here. So I'm very grateful and looking forward to a very engaging dialogue. I want to thank my colleagues who organized this book launch for me. I know everybody worked so hard to make it possible, so thank you very much. Before I start, I want to thank 3 more people, my kids and my husband. They sustained me, supported me to make the book possible. When I was writing the book, sometimes it was not easy. And one day I remember, in particular, I was feeling it's so hard, it's impossible. I was complaining. And my son, who was back then about 5, said to me, "Mommy, it's not that hard. You put letters into words, words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, and paragraphs into chapters. Then you will have a book." So that was very wise advice. I followed, and I have the book. I thank him for that, who is probably now on Facebook watching. My other son, who was inside my belly back then, produced a lot of nauseous feelings, pain, but also reminded me there's life, there's more important things than just writing. So that was a great divergence for my attention and energy. But mostly I want to thank my husband, who supported me in all the ways he can. Mostly he just stayed out of my way so that I could concentrate on the book writing. He took my son out to play dates, museums, and every day he got home, he would ask, "How was your day?" And I would report, hopefully not to disappoint him. But one day I was so excited, I made breakthroughs. And he said, "How was your day?" I said, "Wonderful, I decided to write a new chapter." He said, "Okay, that's my 2 extra months of child care." So chapter 6 is for you, my husband. So I'm going to share with you the findings in this book called Welfare, Work, and Poverty, Social Assistance in China. What is it? It's called dibao, or Minimum Livelihood Guarantee. It's China's primary social assistance policy program, and it's world's largest such program in terms of population coverage. at this moment, it covers 60 million people, about 15 million in urban areas and 45 in rural areas. But this is 10 million less than 2 years ago. So it used to be even larger than this. It started in 1993, initiated in Shanghai, China's most developed city. It's because back then there were a lot of layoffs from state-owned enterprises. And the local government felt they need to address the growing urban poverty, which really didn't exist in China before. And then they were also trying to maintain social stability, because these people who are newly poor, who lost their jobs, might take it to the street if they don't get their livelihood sustained. And based on Shanghai's very successful experience, the central government decided that this will become a national policy. So in 1999, all Chinese cities adopted this policy. So it became a national policy in urban areas. And by 2007, based on the successful urban experience, it was adopted into a national rural policy. So it is a typical means testing social safety net program. It involves, I call 2.5 means testing, 2.5 tests. The first one is means testing, income and assets. Your family has to have income and or assets below the local dibao line, so to qualify for this benefit. The second test is a household registration status test. You have to be local resident to hold the local city or rural registration status, or hukou, to be eligible for this benefit. That means about 170 million rural to urban migrants are excluded from this program. The half test I refer to is called behavioral test. It's not often explicitly stated, but if you happen to have a pet, if you own a refrigerator or cell phone, if you send your kids to expensive private schools, you may not qualify to benefit from the local dibao. So it's a behavioral test, not always stated, but often used to gauge people's eligibility for this benefit. It's centrally regulated and locally implemented. So the responsibility for dibao is with local governments, but the central government gives a lot of subsidy to those localities who cannot afford to pay for it on themselves. So like any other social assistance programs in the world, dibao serves two goals. One is to serve as a last resort safety net for the very poor. The other is to maintain social order, social control, so that these people do not become desperate. Here's China's dibao screening procedure, rather stringent. You have to first submit an application, then people will come to do in-home visits and interviews to understand your income and other family situations. And then there will be a step called participatory appraisal. That means your neighbors, local community leaders will be invited to come together to appraise your situation, to judge if you do indeed qualify. Then the next step, if you pass the previous 3 steps, your names will be publicly displayed so that the broader community can comment and give feedback to see whether you truly qualify or whether you didn't tell the whole truth. Then the next step will be for local governments or communities to randomly select from those who passed the previous steps from this list, to select a few and verify if they do qualify. So it's a higher level of test. And then lastly, those who pass all these tests can get approved. And then in 3 or 6 or 1 year, 3 or 6 months or 1 year, you will have to go through this application process again. So it's a rather stringent, strict process. Similar to some other countries, but probably in terms of procedures, more demanding than in many countries. So is it working? This is a grand and sustaining social experiment. What are the results? In this book, I offer a comprehensive evaluation in all possible outcome aspects. First, are the benefits adequate? My answer is they are low despite their constant growth. So this picture shows that local dibao lines averaged within urban and rural areas respectively. The unit is monthly yuan, the Chinese renminbi unit. So from 1999 to 2015 in urban areas and from 2007 to 2015 in rural areas, dibao lines on average kept increasing, right? Very good news. This next picture shows that adjusted by consumer price indexes, which will switch the bars from the blue bars to the red bars, the lines still kept increasing, but the pace of increase slowed much than the previous slide, right? This next picture shows the dibao lines as a percentage of per capita consumption level. That is, not to look at the actual dibao lines, but relative to the average consumption level, where would the dibao lines be? This picture reversed the previous trend, where the urban lines were higher than the rural lines. This shows that relative to the per capita consumption level, the rural dibao lines are actually higher than the urban ones. However, they are not high either. So in rural China, by 2013, the dibao line on average was about 33% of average consumption. In urban China, by 2013, 20%. Not a very high level of consumption. Of course, not terribly low either. Second question, second outcome to look at. What's the population coverage? How many people benefit from this program? The coverage is larger, broader in rural areas than in urban areas, but both have been declining in recent years. This picture shows the number of urban and rural dibao recipients, both in their raw numbers, which are shown in the bars. So the blue bars are the urban recipients. The red bars are rural recipients. Then I have two lines. The green line is showing the urban dibao's recipients as a percentage of the urban population. And then the blue line is the rural dibao recipients as a percentage of rural population. So the two lines increased initially, but then declined in recent years, right? By 2015, the urban dibao population, or dibao recipients, was only slightly above 2% of the entire urban population, a very small proportion. The rural dibao recipients, about 8% of the rural population. So from this, you can not only see the narrow population coverage, but also the shift from the central government's focus from urban to rural dibao over the years. Here are the characteristics of the urban and rural dibao recipients. This is from 2014. So most of them in urban areas, 62% are working age adults. Among them, many are either holding temporary jobs or registered or non-registered unemployed. Only 2% had regular jobs. And then we had about 16% older people and 22% children who were urban dibao recipients. Similar picture in rural China, but with more older adults, 40% receiving dibao. That's mainly because of the lack of a sufficient pension system in rural areas. But the highlight in this picture is to show that most dibao recipients are working age adults. So the challenge remains that how to move these people from welfare to work. Next outcome, targeting. Dibao is a targeted public assistance program, whether it's really reaching its intended population. There are significant errors in targeting, However, researchers have found China's dibao's targeting is better than many other developing countries, highlighting the challenge, the difficulty in really targeting the very poor. So this picture summarizes a set of studies based on 5 different data sets over the years to estimate targeting errors. I used 2 measures. One is called leakage rate, which means among those who are eligible, who are leaked or not covered. Some also refer to it as exclusion error rate. The other rate I look at, which is captured by dark bars, is mistargeting rate. Among those who actually benefit from this program, who do not qualify, but actually benefited from it, right? If we focus on the light bars, the white bars, those are the leakage rates. They range from 42% to 54%. Not trivial, right? Serious leakage errors. If we switch to mistargeting rates, even higher. The highest estimate is 76%. Are they so devastating to us? Not that much. These are not great numbers to see, but if you put China into the global context, many other countries show similar results. It's because targeting is very hard. It's hard to gauge, measure, estimate, and have people report their income and other resources. So these are seen often, and I actually, since the publication of the book, have a new paper to use 2012 data from China, and we see the same results. Next, dibao is an anti-poverty program targeting the poor. So how is its anti-poverty effectiveness? It's modest, and especially on the poverty rate. It does better in reducing the poverty gap and severity. So this table summarizes a set of results. In the book, I have many more, but this represents the overall picture. So this captures the anti-poverty effectiveness of rural dibao in 2008 using the official national poverty line, which was back then 1,200 yuan per person per year, not a high poverty line. So if we focus on the top panel, which looks at only the dibao recipients, and see the red numbers, which are the reductions due to dibao transfers, in the poverty rate, 21%, in the poverty gap, or the depth of poverty, 33%, and then on the poverty severity, how far away and how severe your poverty status is, 38%. Those are important reductions, but modest. The bottom panel of this table shows, if we look at the whole rural population, what are the poverty reduction results due to dibao? They are small, 2%, 4%, 3%. So dibao apparently, clearly, is a very targeted anti-poverty program. So it goes to the poor, but if we put them into the national or broader population context, the anti-poverty effects are small. Are these people who are mostly working age adults moving from welfare to work? There are many local initiatives, but there is little evidence. So the answer to this is we actually don't know whether they work well or not. We need much more rigorous evaluations. So there are broadly 4 types of local welfare to work initiatives. There are punitive ones. Dibao recipients are assigned mandatory voluntary work. You have to take them, but they are characterized as voluntary. If you don't take them once, twice, okay, but 3rd time, you will lose your dibao eligibility. So punitive approaches. Next type, protective. Certain dibao recipients, those with disability, those who are older, who lack work capabilities, would have a higher income disregard. If the local dibao line is 500 yuan, you can have a 600 yuan threshold. right? So that's more protective of your income than to others. The next kind is called providing incentive to dibao recipients. If you find a job, I'm not going to take that income transfer to you right away. I will give you 3 months, 6 months, so that you stabilize your job, and then you may lose your dibao benefits. And lastly, the government, mostly local governments, offer some supportive measures to offer skills training, job referrals to dibao recipients so that their transition from welfare to work can be facilitated and even sustained. I have some local evidence from this, not hugely successful, but with some successes. So the answer to this welfare to work transition question is that there are many local experiments. We just don't have enough evidence. So for this in the book, I really want to emphasize and promote the partnership between scholars, local governments, to include the evaluation efforts from the beginning, from the design of these programs, and then we can learn from these initiatives. Another aspect of the challenges faced by welfare to work transition is the family care responsibilities and lack of social services faced by many of these dibao recipients. You may offer trainings, you may disregard higher income, but if you cannot solve their family care challenges, if you don't provide services, then they just cannot move to work. So here's a quote actually from Professor Saulinger, who does this quantitative work. So she quoted from a laid-off 45-year-old woman who had to stay home nearly all the time to take care of her 22-year-old son with mental illness. She said, "I cannot leave my son. He cannot do anything. I have to feed him 3 meals a day. If he were to boil some hot water, I fear he'd get scalded. He's completely without intelligence. If he sees something, he'll want to go play, like with those electrical plugs. I don't dare to get away. Something could bring disaster to other people." So a lot of worry and also lack of resources and support. What about family consumption? How do these dibao families use their money? In this regard, we have some good news. The dibao recipients are actually able to use the money they receive to spend on human capital investment, mainly healthcare and education. That, on the other hand, reflects the high needs faced by these families in healthcare and education. I offer 2 quotes. One, an interview with a 43-year-old mother who says, "The main expenses are medicine. Every month I have to spend over 100 yuan, nearly 200 on medicine. My daughter and I, our monthly income is 690 yuan dibao money, that's all. So we have about 500 yuan left after paying for the medicine. Everything costs money, rent, water, electricity, gas, right? Not to mention others. So healthcare is the most important need, but there are also other survival needs to be met." Here's another quote from a 44-year-old father who himself has some health problems. He said, "You see, it's almost September 1st, but honestly, I barely have money for food. I don't know where my next meal is from. I get help from this person, that person. When the semester starts, I have to pay over 3,000 yuan, 2,200 for tuition, and the rest fees for books and others. How can I pull together that much money?" Right? So this highlights the concrete, serious challenges in healthcare and education faced by these families. The families may be able to use their dibao resources on these needs, but what about other needs? Or are they enough to cover these needs? Lastly, I look at dibao recipients' social participation and subjective well-being. Are they happier? Do they have a lifted mood? Do they feel a brighter future because of the welfare support they get. The reality is not so much. They feel mostly isolated and lack personal fulfillment. So here I offer a picture which captures how dibao might affect the time use patterns of the recipients. So these are the time spent on leisure and social activities. In hours per day, I look at both work days and non-work days. So the darker bars are typical work days, and the lighter bars are typical non-work days. If we focus on the first two bars, we see that for urban recipients and rural recipients, both have significantly lowered time spent on leisure and social activities, on both work days and non-work days. Probably not causal, but a very strong persistent pattern shown among the dibao recipients. The other bars capture the subcategories of leisure and social activities: participation in recreations, using the internet, even exercising, social activities, even reading and watching TV. So anecdotally, many dibao recipients in qualitative interviews would say they are afraid to appear to enjoy life, go to a movie, hanging out with neighbors, because others may judge them to say, how can you have this much fun? You seem to be doing well. Why do you deserve this free money? So this is one aspect I do plan to look further into in future research, but the current evidence suggests a not so bright picture. So we have evaluated all outcome aspects of dibao. According to my respected colleague, Wang Feng, who is a professor of sociology, who wrote this, the findings of this book are sobering. I didn't think of that when I wrote it, but exactly this word captures the whole message. Dibao has had some successes, a lot of growth over the years, broad coverage, but these lessons are alarming, reminding, and sobering that as researchers, as policymakers, as the public, we can do a lot more to make it better. So what can be done? Many things. I would suggest a few. We need higher dibao lines or more generous benefits so that they are not so meager. They can meet at least some basic needs and also cover health and education benefits or needs. I think the population coverage needs to be expanded. China, as in many other countries in these safety net programs, emphasize so much of the importance of targeting, which is important. But targeting sometimes means narrowing the population coverage, which is a big price to pay in anti-poverty efforts. We need to provide stronger work support to make work pay so that a lot of these adults with work capabilities can actually earn a living, which is what they prefer to do. We need to look at human needs more than the basic survival needs, to consider the multidimensional needs of human beings, not only education, health, but also personal fulfillment, right? Social activities. Those are important. We need to focus on children. Many of the dibao recipients in interview data say that we dare not to share this information with our children because once the information is made public, the children will also be scrutinized in schools or they will be labeled. So that is one challenge. Some low-income population, low-income interviewees say they don't apply for dibao because they don't want their kids to be singled out. And that actually is measured by some recent research in the US. There's a new book called $2 a Day, which looks at the 4 million people in the US who live under $2 a day, and many of them do not apply for welfare. They actually qualify. Lastly, I think so important for us as social workers, dibao families need so much social support in terms of social resources, social services. They have so many needs, especially child care, senior care needs, they don't have. So that's where social workers could play a much larger role. In fact, the Chinese government has been teaming up with the Asian Development Bank and other international organizations to explore how to most effectively connect social assistance and social work services. So I hope there's quicker breakthrough in that regard. So there are other options. There's a new book called Just Give Money to the Poor. So universal allowance, no strings attached. Would that work? And then another proposal by David Kerp, who was a visiting scholar at the Population Center here, wrote this op-ed in New York Times. What do the poor need? Ask them, right? These poor, low-income families have different needs. And then by giving them the one-cut policy or program may not solve their individual issues. If you ask them, they will tell you, and maybe that's more effective. Also, researchers and politicians are suggesting that if we give people in need a monthly check or a universal allowance, that might be a way to have everybody have a fair, equal start. There's an upcoming event which our Poverty and Social Policy Center is co-sponsoring to talk about the potential effects of universal allowance in the US, and that could be debated in China as well. So many policy options still allowed to learn from the reality, from its effectiveness. But I learned a lot writing this book, and I look forward to learning more in future. Thank you.
So I have a couple questions that I'll ask, and then we'll chat a little, and then open it to the audience. So, do we have any idea why the participation rates have declined in the last couple of years?
So I think partly it's the political environment. China has made a lot of progress in reducing poverty, in lifting people's living standards. In that regard, partly to reflect that success, the government has tried to narrow the coverage, because in people's minds, dibao is equated with poverty. So if you have fewer people covered or receiving this benefit, that means lower poverty rate. I have to also mention that the Chinese government now is focusing so much on rural poverty. There's a new grand campaign called Targeted Anti-Poverty Campaign, 精准扶贫, for those of you who understand Chinese. It's to focus on rural areas. It's not a public assistance program, but it's really to bring economic opportunities to those who are poor so that we could escape poverty from sustained growth and job opportunities. The goal is to eradicate poverty in China by 2020. Very ambitious.
That's very ambitious. Yeah. Well, it's so that I could see that poverty is going down, so that would, even with no changes, could reduce the eligibility. But it sounds like they've also, what you're describing, the government is also narrowing the eligibility.
Yes.
So it might be useful to try and separate those two as a research project.
Yep.
How much of it is coming from one or the other.
Yes. Yes.
So another thing that occurred to me when you were talking, so I was, you noted that there was a very small effect on the poverty rate and a bigger effect on the poverty gap. My guess is that would be true for
Yes.
rich nations as well, if you look at the safety net. And
Yes.
again, I'm thinking, how different would that be? I think it may be quite similar. So yes?
Yeah, I agree with you. In the book, I devoted one whole chapter to this and have probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 tables, really to look at this thoroughly using 4 sets of different poverty lines, different samples, data sources, and the results are very similar. And I think it is similar to both developed and developing countries.
I was just saying, speak a little closer to the mic for the live streamers.
We'll do. So, last question that I have, well, actually I have several, I don't want to hog the floor. So, you mentioned child allowances, universal child allowances. Is anyone in government? Is that on the
No.
Okay.
I'm going to advocate for it, but no. The Chinese population is so large. The child allowance, so in the US, there has been calculations, even that is huge. In China, it's just too big. Physically, it's not possible. Nobody would want to take it up. And then there's, of course, huge inequality, right? If it's universal, everybody will get it. And then cultural values, right? Does everybody really need it? Who deserves this? It's a huge debate. I don't think the public support or political will is there. But to me, many of the challenges dibao faces, as other public assistance programs face in other countries, is the constant struggle between who deserves to get it and how much, and then the administrative costs involved. So this might be an option, and I'm hoping maybe one locality would be willing to give it a try.
In the U.S., there are now some localities that have ballot initiatives to have actually basic income, which is child and adult allowances, and tie it to the environment. So the idea is to have a carbon tax and give the money from the carbon tax back to the population. An interesting combination of 2 different social concerns.
So I would add that in China's new targeted anti-poverty campaign, a main approach adopted is to promote clean energy use and connect local people with companies and investments to promote environmental safe and protection projects to reduce poverty.
Thank you so much. That was very exciting. You made me get excited about writing a book. So thank you so much. I have one question and one observation, but probably I'll put all that in one question. You gave great lessons at the end, where China can do this, can do the other, different options. So the question is, where does China look to for answers? Are these normally homegrown initiatives? Because I work in Africa, and in Africa we always look to the West, to Europe, and we say, this is what they did, how can we modify that? And sometimes we also look to other, quote unquote, some Asian tigers, what they have done, and that kind of stuff. And also look to Latin America. So where does China normally look for answers, and whom do they learn from? And so in some of my work, we also look to Singapore. And I think that we look at Singapore in terms of their welfare, their policy, anti-poverty policy, which really is based on an asset-based framework, that every child receives an asset at birth, and then that goes on when they are in school, after school, when they retire, and that kind of stuff. So where do they look for answers? And do you think that they could look to countries within Asia and learn from them, or I don't want to say that they're so proud, but or do they think that they are the leaders in the field?
That's a great question. China over the years, especially since the opening up about 40 years ago, has really tried to learn from any country. They sent officials to learn from, to be trained from many other countries in Asia, in Europe, in the US. But the most lessons they actually adopted from my observation is from Europe. So dibao itself is not brought in a lesson learned from others. It's really based on local experimentation and then adopted gradually from, by other cities, other localities, and the central government. And that's another approach China uses. So they try things out in different localities. If it works, they make it broadly adopted. If it doesn't, then it's fine, it will stop. In social insurance programs, pensions and health care reforms, they learned heavily from Europe. Now, I think they are involving more insights, experts from other countries. Right now, mostly the EU, and also World Bank, Asian Development Bank, other international organizations to help with dibao.
So have you thought about lessons from Singapore?
I'm not aware of any direct implementation or lessons from Singapore. I think China certainly looked into Singapore. The challenge there is Singapore is so small. China is so big and diverse. Maybe one locality can use Singapore's lessons, but to use it to the whole country would be very difficult. I do want to add things you do, asset-based approaches, is now quite appreciated and becoming popular in China. So some localities adopted it. I think in the national policy dialogue, it's very much part of the social policy direction conversation.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I guess like my immediate reaction to this is like there are just so many glaring problems to delve more into. Like, you know, the public shaming of like giving people the dibao, and also the really low threshold for poverty line. So I guess like my question, I have so many questions, but exactly how is poverty reduction measured, and how effective do you think that measure is, like to actually really, like, you know, taking into account of how people can really live a decent life and how well their life quality is, like how does that measure is able to, how can that capture, how well it captures that? Yeah.
That's a question that Irv and I could spend 2 years or 2 semesters to address. Poverty is a complicated, long-lasting issue, and it's also deeply rooted in each society's history, culture, values, political system, economic situation. Some of you may be familiar with poverty debates here in this country, and it's not easy. Measurements, definition, what to capture, what not to capture. In China, traditionally, as in the case in dibao, poverty is defined purely based on income, with a little extra information from assets. But assets are not easy to capture in many cases and secondary. So it's based on income. Now, I think based on this growing evidence, many scholars and even public policymakers are advocating to use consumption approach, which many countries do. So your consumption needs probably more accurately reflect your poverty status. But there are also many other dimensions. I have new research that looks into material deprivation. Do you have clean water? Can you use the internet, right? Those things are important. How close are you to the local clinic or a doctor or nurse, right? There's also another approach which is very important and prominent in economics, which I hope more people do, is to look at social capabilities, right? Not only the things you have or not have, or you can access or not, but the social aspect of it. When you need resources, can somebody lend you a hand, right? When you need to get some money, loans, can you get it? All of those things. So poverty is so complex and multifaceted. One measure will not do. But for policymakers, they need simple guidelines. If you want them to consider everything, it's impossible, right? So they could only use some simple measures so that policies are clean-cut and people can understand it and they can implement it. And that's also very much the debate for dibao and for the U.S. many poverty-based programs.
So I would add just one thing to elaborate on the last thing you said. So I would say that you could, no matter how you measure it, if you look at the achievement of China, there's just no question that poverty has been reduced dramatically. And if you look across the world, 3/4 of the reduction in world poverty, something like, I made that up, maybe 2/3, but it's big, is all due to China. And dibao contributes to that, but is not the main driver. It's really the privatization, this switch from state provision of virtually everything. So it's pretty remarkable what's happened. And I think, again, no matter what measure you use, and I love the measures that are used in the book, you would, I think, get the same answer. It's not, dibao is not eliminated poverty, but it makes a big dent in terms of reducing the poverty gap. So for people at the very bottom, it has really made a big difference. I was struck by the public shaming too, I must say. It's and there I would say it's not Europe, or at least not modern day Europe. It's the U.S. does more of that than the European nations. I don't know if that was deliberate, the copying of what we do, but it's stigma, the idea that people don't really deserve this assistance, and you want to make it difficult. In the U.S., we talk about the Puritan work ethic, but obviously it's not just Puritan.
So in the book, I talk about the values behind dibao, and those values are deeply Chinese, but also very similar to U.S. values. Emphasis of work, self-reliance, family, right? Your family should be the first one to be responsible for the problems. The government would take a paternalist role, but a very limited role. So those are very similar between our two countries. Another aspect of the public displaying or shaming is, I think, largely legacy or characteristic of the communist regime in China, right? Everybody participated in the building of the great socialist communist country. And in that participation, everybody knows everybody's business. And that was considered good. And that was carried out in this dibao screening as well. So, and people have that willingness, habit, justification to do so. Yeah. Please.
I'm sorry I got here late and maybe I missed what I'm about to ask, but how difficult is it for migrant workers in the cities to get access to dibao? And also, is there anything in the way of job training in China?
So migrants, almost impossible for them to get dibao, because one rule for dibao is that it's only open to local residents. In the past 5-6 years, some localities who are very developed have loosened their regulations so that some long-term migrant residents can apply and qualify, but very, very limited. In terms of welfare to work trainings, I have one chapter on that. There are many local initiatives, job trainings, referrals, but their effectiveness are limited, are really not evaluated much.
Do we have any questions from Facebook?
Yeah, we have 3 actually. There's been about between 10 and 15 people on the live stream at any point. I'm speaking quietly because it's going to be kind of loud on the on the stream, which is picking this up. So I have 3 questions. Should we just do them one at a time? I feel like asking all 3 can be overwhelming sometimes. But I think you more or less answered the first question about how does the community approve of the existence of social welfare programs. You talked about the shaming, but they asked specifically about universal allowance. Has there been any proposals around that? I'll just stop there.
So both excellent questions. Community involvement, as I covered, there are several stages. So usually local communities elect or select representatives who participate in this process. So they give feedback. But also local community leaders play an important role. There have been some corruption charges in dibao programs, saying local officials didn't do a good job in deciding who is truly eligible, who is not. And then most recently in 2012 or 14, the central government stipulated through a new set of rules that it's not the village leaders, it needs to be the township or county level leaders who really decide and make the final call. So that has pros and cons, but the idea is to reduce the local error-making space. Your second question about universal allowance, no, not broadly speaking in China, universal allowance is not so much a policy option on the table, although one policy that was universal, which was launched in 2011, was a universal subsidy to orphans. So all Chinese urban and rural orphans receive a monthly stipend, and not a very low one. So that was a very progressive policy. But because the population covered is relatively not that huge, I don't have the number with me, but if you expand that to the poor population or some other population that is a much larger number, that would be a challenge.
Great, and I think you started to go into the second question I was going to ask, but we actually have someone tuning in from Saudi Arabia, and their question was, in my country, like tribal leaders have power to prevent government support from reaching needy people. So how can social workers help establish a solution to help? And maybe you can discuss in the Chinese context, obviously.
That's a great question, and it's actually has some resemblance to the Chinese context. Some local officials or leaders, especially in rural areas, because the villages are so small and they have typically been leaders for a long time, they would proudly claim that they know the village so well, they know every family, and they don't, even though this procedure is not so perfect, but they don't think they need to follow that procedure. They could handpick the 10 families that are most needy according to their assessment, and then they decide who get it. So I didn't show the picture, but the rural targeting errors are much larger than urban targeting errors, and that's one challenge similar to the types that you just mentioned. How social workers can play a role, I think it will take some time. China is producing so many social workers very quickly, but most of them still want urban jobs. And rural villages may want some, but they don't know what they can do either. So it will take some trying out and take our innovative social workers to think of programs, initiatives to connect that bridge.
Thank you for your presentation. I actually have 3 questions, and 2 of them are more for information. Because you mentioned the eligibility, you said it's below local dibao line. So I'm thinking, is it standardized or is it like different from place to place?
Mm-hmm.
And the second is about the mistargeting rate. Also, as you mentioned, targeting the arrows. And I'm just curious, like in research, how does this number collected? Since you can collect the arrow number, then why at the very beginning you cannot prevent it? And then the third thing is about, as someone asked migrant worker before, so I want to ask Professor Gao that how do you see the barriers has, like household registration system has placed in implementing dibao system?
Excellent questions. About the dibao lines, yes, they are very local. So each city and each county have their own dibao lines, and separately for urban and rural areas. In some cities where the different districts are developed very unevenly, they even have district dibao lines. Because dibao's financial responsibility are with the local governments, so they have a lot to say in deciding the dibao line. And that's really very closely related to their economic development stage. In the book, I have pictures and paragraphs to show those. In recent years, the Chinese government is pushing for the urban-rural unification of dibao, so that when possible, the urban and rural lines would be similar, or unified, or become the same. I'm doing an evaluation project for the World Bank on this. It's also very complicated, different developments in that regard. But some are fully unified, and people are not so happy because the consumption levels are so different, right, as I showed. So this, again, is complicated and reflects the tension among such a big country. In terms of targeting, you asked a very good question, and Professor Garfinkel and I had done some joint work on this. It's not easy. So what we do is to use household survey data. So we survey people and ask them to report their incomes. And we assume and we hope their reports of income and other resources would be more accurate than what they tell the government. Right? So based on our estimates and compare that to the dibao lines, we estimate who qualify and then compare that with who actually get it so that we get errors. Those are not perfect. People don't report 100% accurately to researchers either. Another challenge is that in reality, dibao eligibility is determined monthly or every 3 months, every 6 months. In surveys, we get annual income. So we don't capture the dynamics of change within the time period. So that means we make some errors too. So in the book, I again use multiple data sources, different gauging methods to see what the range of possible targeting errors are. Lastly, migrant workers. They have not been a target of this program, despite some recent progress. You may have noticed that the government is loosening the FUCO regulations. So we will see, probably in the near future, the merging of urban and rural populations. I think in future, not only because of the FUCO reform, but also because the increased use of social media, globalization, if you can think of. So people are more demanding of their equal rights, whether they are urban residents, rural residents, migrants, right? They see what others have, can access, and they want the same. So I think that voice will come out. even though it will be slow progress, but there will be progress. Thank you.
We have one more question. I think it'll be good for both speakers. Sarah asks, has there been data gathered on asking the poor what their needs are? If so, are there examples of needs that have been established?
So in China, in recent years, there are certainly more data collection efforts covering different regards. For example, one recent data set I'm using has a module on time use. How do people spend their time, right? That reflects a lot about people's life quality, how they allocate resources. There are also some data collection efforts among the more poor regions. So another project I'm collaborating with collects data from 5 poor provinces in rural areas in central and west China. So there we gather a lot more information about people's survival and material needs, water, road conditions, flushing, toilets, etc. So we can understand their living situations in a much more nuanced way and probably, hopefully, offer better policy suggestions. There are certainly a lot more to be done. I think many of my colleagues in China, including those who work in universities, think tanks, and also international organizations, they have gathered a lot of data, but some of them are not written up in English, so not so available to the broader global audience. So I'm hoping we help promote that as well, so that the Chinese case can be entered into the global dialogue. There are recently a few new books that are very good. There's one book called Social Assistance in Developing Countries, which covers many developing countries in the US. There are 2 updated volumes about the US social safety net, just came out. So I think there are a lot more efforts on these. And I think to gather more detailed measures, information would be wonderful.
So I would add 2 things. So one is that consumption surveys are very good at getting at particular needs, and especially for rural areas, I think income surveys have very serious limits because so much of the economy is in kind, and people grow their own food, etc., etc. In the urban areas, however, you do have much more of a market economy, and income measures are probably fine. In fact, they capture a lot the similarity, I think, to income consumption measures are in an urban area, I think, are pretty close, but not perfect. But what is interesting, you asked, so do we ever ask people what they need? So if you do that, in some cases we have done that, and I think it's very interesting. There's questions about how much income would you need to not be poor? And there are a number of surveys that include questions like that. And it turns out to be, and then you can use that and compare it to actual incomes. And it turns out that people, the lower income you have, the less you report needing in order to have a decent life. And the higher income you have, the less you, so, and where those lines cross is actually very interesting. And turns out to mirror a lot of official measures of poverty. So the subjective, this asking of people, what would you need not to be poor, turns out to come pretty close in a lot of instances to what experts not looking at that issue say you would need. So it's actually a very interesting question, and we have some data. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, why is there poverty? So, what is the main reason for poverty in China, in urban and both in rural? And then my other question is, you mentioned a community or a town in the United States that provided some kind of incentive for carbon environmental. I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but if you could just answer that too, I'm curious as to what the community is that does that. Thank you.
I'll let Qin answer the first one.
Why poverty? Complicated question. In the book, I provide one section which is a profile of the dibao recipients that captures why sometimes they think they are poor, or look at the concrete factors that lead to their poverty. Many of these have either young children or members who are physically disabled or with mental illness, or who are older but do not have a pension. So the family composition with those members matter a lot. The other aspect, since a lot of the dibao recipients are working age adults, of course many of them need to care for these family members. But many are also left behind by China's economic reform, which turned the former planned economy into a market economy, right? Formerly, they had secure jobs that they could inherit and keep the job for life. But now they have been thrown into the market and they have to compete. And many of these people feel they lost their fair chance. Their education, the skills they got are not up to par with the current competition level. I think in the book I quote some interview data where people say, my parents told me to learn this skill. I did way to school, but after I got out of school, this skill is no longer needed. In China also, there's serious age discrimination, especially for women, but also for men. You may have noticed that the few quotes I showed here, these are young people, 40-something, but in the labor market, they would not be welcomed because people think they are already too old to be kept updated with technology skills. So you can imagine for people who in their 40s, 50s, and then 60s to not be able to find a job and then have to apply for dibao.
So I'll comment on that, why poverty. Every country has poverty, and the reasons are much the same. So we're born dependent and we die dependent mostly. If you're lucky, you live a really long life and you're able-bodied until the very end, then you're incredibly lucky. But a lot of people who become old aren't welcome in the labor market. That's true across the world. It's true across the world. They're not as productive. And if you don't have the social institutions, they're going to be poor. And that's what the welfare state in rich nations is about. It's what the welfare state in poor nations are about. It's a complement to market economy, these socialist institutions that we call the welfare state. They're essential. Old age insurance was invented in Germany, Bismarck, conservative chancellor, because of social stability. And the Socialist Party was the strongest socialist party in the rich world at that time. and was a serious threat. And that's why Germany adopted social insurance. Disability. Disability is, every country has disabled. Every country has a portion of its population that has mental illness, a portion of its population that have their IQs, their mental ability is so low that they're not going to be able to handle work on their own. So that's just common across countries. And because of that, we design social institutions to address those issues. Every country does in some form or another. And in answer to your question about the carbon tax, these are proposals. Nowhere have they, and one is in Washington, D.C. The other is, I think, Berkeley, that has got on the agenda this idea of having a carbon tax. It turns out there are a number of very influential conservative economists, including the head of our business school here, the dean of our business school, who have proposed the carbon tax combined with a basic income to give the money back. So it's not just a left-wing proposal. It's got support on the right as well. It's very interesting, I think, proposal. What will come of it? Stay tuned. We'll see. So I think we probably should adjourn. There's, if we're lucky, there's food upstairs, a reception, and you're all welcome to join us. Even those on Facebook. It's a long trek, but... 1109 upstairs.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You guys come to 1109. Yeah, but we'll enjoy some. Yeah, that's fine. I think, yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah.